For C3 plants, atmospheric carbon dioxide is fuel. The biological baseline is straightforward. As ambient carbon dioxide levels rise, photosynthesis rates increase. This happens because of an enzyme called rubisco. Higher concentrations of atmospheric carbon dioxide increase rubisco's carboxylation rate, while suppressing its tendency to bind with oxygen, a mechanical process known as competitive inhibition. This standard projection chart plots atmospheric CO2 against expected plant growth. Models predict a carbon-enriched atmosphere drives proportional yields. But look at this second data line mapping actual response under compounding heat. At 36 degrees Celsius, the plant's photosynthetic engine abruptly fails. The subject generating this data is Theobroma cacao L, the cacao tree. To understand why its biological systems fail, we must look at how it evolved. Elevated carbon dioxide is not a uniform fertilizer. For cacao, it operates as a highly conditional physiological buffer, constrained by strict and unforgiving thermal limits. Cacao's native habitat is the lower story of the Amazon rainforest. It evolved to thrive under dense canopy shade and persistent high humidity. Climate projections point to drastic atmospheric shifts targeting these exact regions. Models show carbon dioxide concentrations rising from a baseline of 400 parts per million to nearly 970 by the end of the century, accompanied by severe disruptions to seasonal precipitation. Coupled with this is a projected temperature anomaly driving a persistent warming trend of 1.5 to 5.8 degrees Celsius. Cacao grows through a specific anatomical dimorphism. The plant extends straight upward in an orthotropic phase before branching out laterally to form a plagiotropic canopy. It also relies on caulescent flowering. Instead of blooming on young stems, pods erupt directly from the mature bark of the main trunk. Because of this specialized architecture, single variable climate models fail. Evaluating cacao's survival requires mapping exactly how compounding stressors interact to degrade these specific structures. To isolate these interactive variables, researchers built a full factorial controlled environment experiment. This 3D matrix visualizes the experimental design. The x-axis maps carbon dioxide exposure, testing ambient 400 parts per million against an elevated 700. The vertical y-axis tracks temperature, simulating warming tiers of an additional 2.5 and 5.0 degrees Celsius. The depth, or z-axis, plots soil moisture, comparing a well-watered state against a water deficit. Finally, we isolate the moderate interaction zone, the intersection where 700 parts per million of carbon dioxide meets a 2.5 degree temperature increase. In this quadrant, the data yields a clear physiological shift. Elevated carbon dioxide moves the optimal photosynthesis temperature upward by exactly 2.5 degrees Celsius. Under moderate warming, the plant dynamically utilizes excess atmospheric carbon to offset the thermal penalty. The primary physiological gatekeeper governing this vital offset is the stomate, the microscopic, dynamically adjusting pore located directly on the leaf surface. The rate carbon dioxide enters, or water vapor exits this pore, is stomatal conductance, or GS. It is the baseline metric for gas exchange. When the plant is exposed to elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide, the first step of the buffer mechanism engages. The high concentration of CO2 triggers an immediate physical reduction in stomatal conductance. The pores partially close. By restricting the stomatal aperture, the plant directly reduces transpirational water loss from the leaf. This diagram illustrates the physiological state. Outward water vapor flow is heavily restricted, but the enriched atmosphere maintains inward carbon assimilation. The ratio of these factors is intrinsic water use efficiency, and under elevated carbon dioxide, this efficiency metric spikes. This compensatory buffering is driven by ontogenetic drift. It is highly pronounced in fast-growing juvenile seedlings, but significantly downregulates in mature trees due to sink limitations. The older plants simply cannot process all the surplus carbohydrates. In this moderate state, elevated carbon dioxide acts as a biological shield, manipulating stomatal behavior to hoard water without sacrificing carbon. We shift the analysis to the extreme tier of the experimental matrix, conditions where temperatures exceed 36 degrees Celsius during the day and 27 degrees at night. At this specific, highly critical thermal threshold of 36 degrees, the plant's previously protective carbon dioxide buffer completely and irreversibly collapses. The plant encounters a fatal paradox. The exact mechanism that provided resilience, stomatal closure, becomes its primary liability. Because the stomata are heavily restricted, the plant physically halts transpirational cooling across the leaf surface. This diagram plots the leaf cross-section against vapor pressure deficit, or VPD. As the ambient air heats up and dries out, the VPD rises exponentially. Without transpirational cooling, internal leaf temperatures are driven dangerously above ambient levels. Driven by extreme vapor pressure deficit and low soil moisture, the plant enters an emergency feedback loop. It forces an absolute stomatal lockdown, sealing the pathways completely and cutting off all carbon dioxide ingress, despite the enriched atmosphere. This triggers immediate biochemical starvation. The Calvin cycle inside the leaf is entirely deprived of carbon dioxide. The result is cellular failure. Without carbon to process and under extreme trapped heat, the plant suffers irreversible thermal degradation of the rubisco regeneration processes. The 36-degree tipping point becomes the exact moment the cacao plant's atmospheric defense mechanism literally cooks the organism from the inside out. This biological failure cascades outward, from leaf-level biochemistry to the macro-reproductive development of the tree. When the internal carbon balance collapses, the plant accelerates Shirel wilt. It actively aborts developing fruit to reduce internal competition for dwindling carbohydrates and water. You can see the visual reality here. A healthy pod sits adjacent to a blackened, shriveled Shirel that the tree has jettisoned to survive. Breaching the thermal tipping point drastically accelerates the timeline from initial flower pollination to the first visible symptoms of this wilt. Even the pods that do survive the thermal stress suffer heavily restricted overall growth rates, resulting in significantly reduced final bean biomass. The collapse of carbon assimilation inside the microscopic stomata directly dictates the total failure of the macroscopic economic harvest. The severe physiological response to thermal stress is not uniform across the species. A comparative analysis of differing cacao genotypes, specifically strains like CCN51, SCA6, and PA107, reveals a spectrum of structural resilience. Specific morphological traits hard-coded into these plant architectures govern their sheer capacity to survive past the 36-degree threshold. This radar chart maps performance traits of CCN51 against SCA6. A critical variable is stomatal density. Variance in pore count dictates maximum cooling capacity. We also measure specific leaf area. A lower area provides a thicker leaf, correlating tightly to prolonged drought tolerance. Finally, an optimized root-to-shoot ratio allows specific genotypes to outlast severe water deficit scenarios. By balancing root absorption with canopy evaporation, the plant successfully maintains its stem water potential, keeping internal hydraulics functioning. These structural variations in genotype provide the empirical blueprint required for engineering stress-tolerant crops. Climate parameters are strictly interactive. Single variable models viewing carbon dioxide as an isolated benefit fail to account for the thermal thresholds of tropical agriculture. Millions of smallholder livelihoods depend on the scale of these harvested yields, making the accuracy of multi-stressor agricultural predictions a critical economic requirement. The applied solution is clear. Global breeding programs must integrate full factorial 3D matrix data into their selection criteria. The objective is to identify phenotypic architectures that maximize the moderate carbon dioxide buffer while possessing the anatomical traits required to survive the upper limits of the vapor pressure deficit curve. Every physiological metric we've analyzed, from the carboxylation rate of rubisco to the geometric density of a stomate, exists to protect this final economic product. Identifying these nonlinear thermal thresholds provides a specific data-driven map for adapting the world's cacao supply to a warmer climate.